This part of the story is not just about David beating Goliath, it is about David becoming Goliath. Hi, and welcome back to Kimber's Film Notes, a show where I am diving into the legal subtext of creativity and culture through the lens of film. We left off in my first video discussing the patent wars and the downfall of the motion picture patent company, which was owned by Thomas Edison. And where we left off with that is, the MPPC had been broken apart. It was determined to be a monopoly. And in response to the rule of the MPPC, a lot of independent movie makers had moved out west to California, which was, the birth of Hollywood. That's why Hollywood is where it is today. Picking up there, right? We're going to pick up on the stories of those independent filmmakers who went out west. And ironically, monopolies come back to play. History is circular, it repeats itself. When it comes to the film industry, it's no different. It's easy to think of the legacy studios that we know of today, or at least what used to be the legacy studios. I think streaming has definitely changed the industry even more, which we're going to get to in later videos. The legacy studios that many of us grew up with, like Warner Brothers, 20th Century, they're still around, just operating differently due to technological changes and just the way the industry has changed. But it's easy to think that they've always been these big conglomerates that we just know them to be, but that's not the case. At one point, Goliath was once David, right? And in the first video when we were looking at the MPPC, it was very much a David versus Goliath kind of story. This is about David becoming Goliath, which again, that is a theme and a story that we see very often in history across all industries. Something that I think is really interesting when you look at early film history and these studios is that a lot of these studios were specialized. Like, they were known for creating certain types of movies with certain stars. And we're going to get into the star system in the next video. I was initially going to do both in one, but there's just so much to discuss, especially with, a legal subtext, that I needed to split them into two. For example, Warner Brothers was known for gangster films. Columbia and RKO were really known for screwball comedies. This isn't to say that they didn't make other genres of movies, but at the time when they got really good at a specific genre and they, a lot of the stars that they were contracted with, when they kind of became typecasted, it's like, why not continue to put them in roles in movies that we know works? So that's essentially what was going on then. A good modern day comparison, in my opinion, would be like A24. When an A24 movie comes out, you can pretty much expect that it's going to be some sort of psychological thriller or horror film. The first legal term that I kind of wanted to break down that I think is actually, it's applicable with this story, but it's also applicable for a lot of people in general, because many people go on to start their own business, they become entrepreneurs, and again, we're looking at early film history. So a lot of these big legacy studios once started as startups. They were scaling at one point. And so I wanted to break down business formation. Business formation is the legal structure of your business, and it's going to determine how you pay taxes and the regulations you may or may not need to follow. You can find a lot more information about business formation, especially if you're in the process of starting your own business or growing your own business, at the Small Business Administration, SBA.gov. They have a lot of really great resources for people. I want you to think of these legacy studios in their, in their infant stages. The big five were Warner Brothers, Paramount, MGM, 20th Century Fox, and RKO, and I'm going to give a little profile of each. So Warner Brothers was started by Polish-Canadian brothers Harry, Albert, Sam, and Jack Warner, who made films grittier and cheaper than Paramount. They were known for stars such as Humphrey Bogart, one of my favorites, Betty Davis, and Olivia de Havilland, which both of those, I'm going to be discussing their stories in more depth in the next video when we get into the star system. Warner Brothers was also the first studio to invest properly in sound technology. Paramount was started by a partnership between two Jewish businessmen named Adolf Zukor and Jesse J. Lasky. There was a lot of European influence with Paramount's movies, and they were known for its Paramount was also known for its stars, Marlene Dietrich, Gary Cooper, Ernst Lubitsch. I also feel like I'm botching some of the pronunciations of I think it's Marlene Dietrich. Dietrich? Oh, I feel bad that I'm botching these, but as a movie lover. Anyways, MGM, founded by American Marcus Lowe and Polish-born American film pioneer Samuel Goldwyn. But MGM, as many movie buffs know, was really driven in its development by Russian immigrant Louis B. Mayer. Lots of legends exist about this man. MGM would later become the largest studio for a while, and it was known for stars like Greta Garbo, Joan Crawford, and Elizabeth Taylor. Next, we have 20th Century Fox. This was started by Russian-born Joseph Schenk, Hungarian William Fox, and American Daryl Zanuck. Fox would go on to lose control of the company in the 1930s, and over time, 20th Century would be known for stars like Henry Fonda, Shirley Temple, and Betty Grable. Last but not least, we have RKO. This was founded by Russian-American David Sarnoff, and it was known for its screwball comedies and stars like Katharine Hepburn, Fred Astaire, and Ginger Rogers. This studio faced a lot of financial instability for most of its existence and would play a big role in the radio and television industries later on. We're going to do a deeper dive into RKO later when I talk about the parallel existence of the radio and television industries. Next, we have the little three. Little because they weren't as integrated as the big five in terms of owning the full cinematic pipeline of production, talent, and distribution. They might rent out actors or production space or equipment to finish a project, whereas the big five, they had the means and the resources to do all of that on their own. So the little three, we're going to start off with Universal Pictures. After moving out west, this company started as Universal Film Manufacturing Company in 1912 as a product of multiple mergers of small independent studios. Many of the independent studios that were a part of this merger were tired of paying fees to the Edison Trust, including Irish-born Patrick Powers and English-born American David Horsley. Later on, the German-American Carl Laemmle would take the helm and buy out the interests of others like Horsley. I just wanted to give a little backstory because Universal Studios, as we know it now, was 1915, but there was a little bit more to it in 1912 because of those independent filmmakers. And if you've noticed already, I'm also including details like Russian-born, English-born, Jewish, and I'm doing that because I think it's really important to keep in mind that, yes, this is, American film history, but a lot of what we enjoy today is a product of immigrants who came over and helped establish these studios and these movies and stars and industries that we've loved for decades now. Next, we have Columbia. This was founded by three American-born businessmen, Harry and Jack Cohn and Joe Brandt, in 1918 as the Cohn-Brandt-Cohn Film Sales Corporation. This was later named Columbia Pictures in 1924. As I said earlier, Columbia was known for screwball comedies and known for stars like the Three Stooges, Jean Arthur, and Cary Grant, which was my grandmother's favorite. And then finally, last but not least, we have United Artists. This was founded in 1919 by English comic and actor Charlie Chaplin, Canadian-American actress and producer Mary Pickford, and American actor Douglas Fairbanks, as well as American film director D.W. Griffith. The founding of this studio was encouraged by the studio system to which United Artists was fighting against. So the studio system that was taking form as these studios were growing in power and popularity, these directors and actors came together to start United Artists in response to the studio system. They weren't happy with how some of these business tactics and tactics of the star system, which again we'll go over in the next video, were playing out. So they wanted to create their own studio. Keep saying studio system, but what is it? I want you to think of both vertical and horizontal integration when you hear studio system. And what I mean by that is studios owned the filmmaking, production, distribution, and exhibition, plus the actors, the talent, and the crew. The rise of the studio system also took place during the Golden Era, which began around the Great Depression. And this is important to note because during the Great Depression, movies provided a source of escape and entertainment during a very dark time in American history. People's morale were low. The movie industry really, especially at this time, these studios were growing, one, in an area where there's this new technology and they're the ones who are getting the benefit of exploring it and being the first ones to kind of put it out there. So they were lucky in the sense that the timing was great on that front, but also at a time when people needed the movies, right? They wanted the movies to increase, again, their morale and their joy, because it was hard to find that in other areas when the whole country was suffering through the Great Depression. There's a few explanations as to why and how the studio system stopped. Some of these I think I'm going to make separate videos for, so we can dive a little deeper into each. But to start, we have the Hays Code, which was the introduction of moral standards for movies. That's a whole other area I would like to get into, so we're going to set that aside for now. The second reason that the studio system came to a close was the Paramount case, and we're going to get into that. I read through it and took notes, so you don't have to. The Paramount case is a product of years of investigation into the film industry prior to the case itself, because of its business practices, and it eventually ended up in the Supreme Court for lots of different reasons that I'm about to explain, but I thought it would help to go over federal question, which is a legal definition that many law students will recognize from their civil procedure classes. But it's good to know these things just so that way the legal industry is not as intimidating to you if you're a consumer or a layperson, you're not working in the legal industry. And so federal question is the jurisdiction given to federal courts in cases involving the interpretation and application of the U.S. Constitution, acts of Congress, and treaties. In some cases, state courts can decide these issues too, but the cases can always be brought in federal courts. In this particular case, we're looking at copyrights because that is what the product of these film studios were making, right? Like, yes, they had the film reels themselves and their equipment, but what they're discussing, the movies, the law that kind of governs over how these movies are licensed, distributed to smaller theaters for exhibition, is copyright law. Copyright law it comes from the Constitution, and therefore the Supreme Court, which is a federal court, has jurisdiction over this case. The next legal definition that I think is really important here, one, because we went over it a little bit in the first video, and two, because the question of monopolies has also come up recently in modern day. Antitrust laws prohibit conduct by a single firm that unreasonably restrains trade by creating or maintaining monopoly power. Most Section 2 claims involve the conduct of a firm with a leading market position. And, when we zoom out and look at these studios that were growing and they were at the forefront of this industry and this technology that was being developed, and these movies that we were creating this culture and system around, they were leading this market. Section 2 of the Sherman Act also bans attempts to monopolize and conspiracies to monopolize. So this is the law that is at issue in this case that we're about to dive into. To be exact, this is United States versus Paramount Pictures Inc. et al. This was decided May 3rd, 1948. So again, the studio system got its start in like the early 1900s, 1912, 1915. It's grown through the Great Depression. It is very much a system and its own industry now. At this point, it's safe to say that these are not just startups anymore, okay? And in 1948, we're looking at the Supreme Court basically saying this studio system cannot exist as it has been existing prior. The court divided the defendants into three groups. There's Paramount, Lowe's, which I didn't mention before, RKO, Warner Brothers, and 20th Century. These defendants produced and distributed. Then there was Columbia and Universal, which also produced and distributed movies. And then United Artists, they were only known for distributing. The major issue, again, is the vertical combination of producing, distributing, and exhibiting motion pictures in a way that violated the Sherman Antitrust Act due to the way in which each distributor contracted with the exhibitors, which unreasonably restrained trade. It is very important to note that the court they're not finding an issue with how the movies are made or like if the consumers can see these movies, because that would necessitate a First Amendment issue. That's not the problem here. The problem is, how are these companies contracting with the theaters themselves to exhibit the movies to the public? The way in which these bigger companies, these producers and distributors are approaching these theaters and contracting with them That is the problem at issue. You'll notice that the Supreme Court is reviewing the decision that was made by a lower court, and so two different courts are mentioned in a way. So the Supreme Court is giving its opinion, but it's also reviewing the opinion that was given by the lower district court. And there's a few restraints by these distributors and producers that the Supreme Court is identifying. So the first one was price fixing. Films are not sold, they are licensed. And this goes to my point earlier. This is a copyright question, right? So under copyright law, when you have a copyright, you're not necessarily, in this particular case that I'm talking about, you can assign away your right or sell your copyright. But in this particular case with these producers and distributors, they are licensing their copyrighted movies to the theaters to be exhibited to the public. Each defendant engaged in a minimum pricing conspiracy horizontally amongst the defendants and vertically between each defendant and their licensees. So again, this goes back to that horizontal and vertical integration I spoke about earlier. The issue that price fixing causes for the licensees, according to the court, is the total effect is that through the separate contracts between the distributor and its licensees, a price structure is erected which regulates the licensee's ability to compete against one another in admission prices. An important quote that I found here is the court stated, for a copyright may no more be used than a patent to deter competition between rivals in the exploitation of their licenses. If you go back to my first video, you'll remember that I referred to patents as the government's version of form of a monopoly. That being said, there are limits to those rights. You cannot, once you have the right, that does not mean you have a monopoly in general. Monopolies are not good. You cannot restrict trade or engage in anti-competitive practices. There still needs to be room for competitors to be able to experiment and ideate and come up with their own creations that fairly compete with yours. So just because you have IP doesn't mean that you can restrain trade in general. First issue was price fixing across the board, and this basically restrained the licensees and their ability to set competitive admission prices. So that's no number one. The second one were unreasonable clearances and runs. So a clearance is designed to protect a particular run of a film against a subsequent run. And a run is a successive exhibition of a feature in a given area. So let's say you have a theater, your local theater, movie that you've been waiting to come out for years finally came out. And the first weekend that it opens, that is the first run. The court found that the clearances were restraints on trade because they were uniform across defendants without regard to special circumstances. So essentially these bigger companies, these producers and distributors were putting these clearance terms into the contract that controlled the way in which the runs of these films at these theaters were being exhibited to a point that it was restricting these theaters and not taking into consideration any sort of special circumstance for that geographic area or for the timing of the release, etc. It's an overexertion of power by the distributors and producers. Next, we have pooling agreements and joint ownership. So the court stated exhibitor defendants had agreements with each other and their affiliates by which theaters of two or more of them, normally competitive, were operated as a unit. Or they were managed by a joint committee or by one of the exhibitors, the profits being shared according to prearranged percentages. So they were taking competitors and pulling them as one unit that they were doing business with. Instead of sharing profits based on, the success of those individual theaters, they were just treating them all the same, again, as one unit, even though these were competing theaters. Defendants were enjoined from further acquisitions of theaters, and they were forced to disaffiliate by terminating joint ownership in certain cases. Next, we have the next restraint on trade that the court identified, formula deals and master agreements. So a formula deal is a licensing agreement with a circuit of theaters in which the license fee of a given feature is measured by a specified percentage of the feature's national gross. The master agreements covered exhibition of two or more theaters in a particular circuit and allowed the exhibitor to allocate film rental payments among theaters as it saw fit. The court found both of these practices as restraints on trade because it eliminated bidding for films by theaters essentially eliminating smaller theaters from choice films and the pulling of purchasing power of an entire circuit. So in this dynamic, if there's a circuit of theaters in larger cities or more successful theaters, the smaller theaters who also want to partake in showing these films, they're pretty much left out. Like they're unable to compete because of the way in which these pooling agreements and these contracts were just gatekeeping. Next, and this is the big one, block booking. So this is the practice of licensing or offering for license one feature or a group of features on condition that the exhibitor will also license another feature or group of features released by the distributors during a given period. The films are licensed in blocks before they actually are produced. United Artists did not engage in this practice, but essentially this prevents competitors from bidding for single features. You can control the copyright. You have a certain bundle of rights that belong to what you've created, but that does not give you power to do what these theaters were doing. And if block booking sounds confusing, think of it like this. So let's say Warner Brothers comes out with a new Humphrey Bogart film. Everyone's excited. Everyone wants to see it. They go to these theaters and they say, all right, you can show this Humphrey Bogart film for this fee, but you have to also buy these other films that are not as good or maybe not as popular. And that's the only way you can show the Humphrey Bogart film. That is block booking in a nutshell. Next, there was discrimination. The court found that defendants had discriminated against small independent exhibitors and in favor of large affiliated and unaffiliated circuits through various kinds of contract provisions. Certain contract terms that allowed advantageous practices were included in contracts with these larger theaters and circuits, but excluded from small independent theaters. So once again, it's just a form of gatekeeping. Next, we have competitive bidding. So the court stated that the judiciary is unsuited to affairs of business management, and control through the power of contempt is crude and clumsy and lacking in the flexibility necessary to make continuous and detailed supervision effective. So therefore, competitive bidding should be eliminated in the court's decree so that a more effective decree may be fashioned. So let me clarify this particular point. The Supreme Court is once again reviewing a lower court's opinion about this case. The lower court was instituting competitive bidding as a potential remedy in this case. The Supreme Court didn't agree. The reason behind this is that courts and judiciaries should not be so steeped in businesses or in art. Like, for example, in copyright cases, something you'll read about often when it comes to deciding whether a derivative work is substantially similar to another one. The judge cannot be an art critic. Like they can't get so steeped in the weeds and the details of the art that they're reviewing, or in this case, the business, that they're infiltrating the rights of those entities, or in copyright cases, that the artist or the creator. So this remedy that the lower court had put forward, the Supreme Court was saying, no, we're giving too much power to the courts. It's not going to be effective. We're not able to do that effectively. You need to come up with a more effective remedy. So that's what's being said there. Finally, I just want to make a note about expansion and the monopoly of theater holdings and divestiture. And this goes back to what I was saying about First Amendment issues. So this particular case, the concern is the monopoly of exhibition, not production. If the issue here was about producing movies, making them, and trying to make some sort of opinion or ruling about how to make movies, that would necessitate the First Amendment because it's a form of speech. But again, that's not the issue here. The issue here are the business practices between these producers and distributors and the exhibitors of those movies, and the contracts between them, and how the exhibitors were controlled by the distributors and producers. I wanted to leave you with a very important quote that I think sums up the heart of the issue in this Paramount case. It is largely out of the ruins of the small operators that the large empires of exhibitors have been built. That is David and Goliath. The result of this case is studios could no longer own theaters, and they couldn't put in place contracts that were overly restrictive. That is how the studio system of the golden age of Hollywood came to a close, with this big Supreme Court case basically saying y'all need to change the way that you are licensing your movies out to smaller theaters.